other people in my generation, whether we're talking about economists, political economists, lay people, I get the sense that in recent years, whether we're talking about people on sort of a resurgent left or on a resurgent right, on both sides we seem to be seeing a falling apart of the ability of the mainstream economic ideology to reproduce itself. Where 10, 15 years ago, most young people would accept what the mainstream economic ideology would have to say, I think in recent years we're seeing it become sort of increasingly under doubt. Whether this is from a resurgent sort of socialist left, as represented by Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders, people to the left of that, or the resurgent right, where we're seeing, questions of free markets and open borders come under question. Ideas of protectionism becoming alive again. So I suppose my question here would be, to what extent would you assume that the ability, or perhaps lack thereof, of economics to regain an ethical footing is a political concern or a political question?
No, that's a very, very, very good observation. I mean, are you really saying that these resurgent movements of left and right don't have any solid basis in the economics that's currently taught? They're political reactions to what are perceived to be just impossible conditions in which people find themselves. But how do you translate that into scientifically based economic policy? And that seems to be, how does one justify, for example, protectionism? One might justify it politically. One might say, that people are subject to an unfair competition, to which the economist would say, well, then you've got to make competition fairer, or I've got to make markets work better in some way, but certainly not take a nationalist view of things. And economics has already told you that redistributionary policies, if people want to do that, that's a political choice, but you've got to understand that that'll make markets less efficient, or that'll reduce the rate of growth. So they will say there's a trade-off between efficiency and morality, and economists tell you the efficient way of doing it. If you want to do it some other way, well, economics isn't telling you anything about that, which raises the prospect that a lot of economic policy in the future won't have very much reference to what economists are saying. But what will they have reference to?
I wanted to just picking up on that a little bit, and just the idea of ethics in economics. I feel like much in the way that the real world functions, in that, we were talking about Smith and Ricardo and Marx, the way that they pictured the world was that there are certain sort of relations that exist and that are in motion, but they are sort of hidden from us in the way that we go about doing our everyday things. Prices sort of act as this wall that don't let us see what is really happening. To me, the way that the economics discipline functions and how ethics in economic functions is very much a mirror of that. In that, I feel like definitely there are ethics in economics. What you just said about free trade not working means that a market is not perfectly competitive. That is an ethical statement. That is in no way a factual statement. It is made a factual statement because the models on which we make this statement take certain assumptions, and those assumptions are purely normative assumptions. I feel like that is where the ethical import of all of this economics that we talk about comes from. And in that sense, it's a perfect way of like fetishizing our model and fetishizing the assumptions, because real world is not working the way it should means there's something wrong with the real world, not something wrong with the way that you're explaining the real world. And so you're automatically giving yourself an ethical standpoint and an ethical superiority sort of in a way, which allows you to make those policy predictions. And what we see now is that the policy predictions coming from those are not working as well, which gives us that greater satisfaction that Daniel, for example, was alluding to from both the left and the right.
Well, that's again very, very powerful point. You see, Robbins and I suppose the mainstream would say the only normative requirement is that people should act efficiently. They would also say, in a way, that they do act efficiently. There's always this, this slide, isn't there, between what's meant to be scientific and normative. If they've come to realise, I mean, for God's sake, they should have. It came rather late in the day that financial markets aren't efficient, but they were trapped by an efficient market hypothesis, which suggested that prices were all accurately. Risks were all accurately priced. That was that a normative assumption, or was that saying this is how rational, given rationality, given certain information requirements, this is how people act? Where is the normative and where is the positive in this? There's always a confusion. I find it runs all the way through, and you've brought it out. The other point I think is extraordinarily important, which is you've referred to something I call and others have called the classical dichotomy, that there's a real world which can be captured by economics and particularly by mathematics. And then there's a world of appearances. And when money gets out of order, it sort of is a veil, yeah? And it hides from you what's really going on. It hides from even rational people. They're deluded by the disorder of money. Therefore, all you have to do actually is have a central bank that makes sure that money doesn't get out of order, and everything will be fine. I've always been struck here by the incredibly powerful allegory of Plato and the cave. Mm-hmm. In the cave, you see only shadows. Beyond the shadows, there's maths.
So maybe following up on that, it is my impression that in the last decade, with the growing debates on inequality, there was a sort of revival of ethical considerations into economics, especially in political debates relating the role of finance that has place in our economy and so on. But I believe that most of these ethical concerns are still pretty much relegated to the sphere of redistribution. Like, our ways of producing are fine. The problem is that we are not redistributing right. So, like, putting the problem just as a matter of circulation and not of an integral matter of production and distribution. And I believe that there are a lot of schools of thought, such as social economics, cooperative economics, feminist economics, and of course, as you mentioned, Marxian economics, that will challenge the way in which we are producing and the way in which we are distributing. So how do you believe that ethics could be reintroduced in economics from this divide?
Well, I entirely agree. There's tremendous dissatisfaction with the distribution of wealth and income. But it seems to me that economics, mainstream economics, says if you want to do something about that, that's a political issue, and if people vote for more equal, well, that's up to them. But what you've got to recognise, it'll make the productive economy less efficient, and therefore they say science is actually opposed to that these desires of people for more equal are sort of irrational in some sense, because I mean they're actually mortgaging their future. They're not behaving according to the dictates of enlightened self-interest, and Lucas is full of lovely quotes about this, about how attention to distribution is incredibly distracting, and it should blah blah blah, and you can multiply those kinds of statements, but I think what you're saying in a way reinforces a point I've made, that the criticisms are coming from outside economics. Now, does that mean that they'll be incorporated into some school of economics that's yet not mature, that hasn't got a scientific paradigm? Because all social sciences claim that there is some scientific basis to them. Economics makes a very, very exaggerated claim to that, but it's there everywhere. So, I mean, what do you think there are emerging paradigms in social economics or the other economics? I mean, we know there is a Marxist paradigm, and we know that. But what about other things that are happening?
Yeah.
I mean, do you?
Yeah,
Do you have hopes of
Actually, if I may, there is a question I would like to pose to you on that. Because, I mean, naturally, there are other paradigms which coexist. They may not have the same scale or influence. However, in your opinion, at least in economics, what is it that makes a paradigm the dominant paradigm? Because that will determine how it will be changed.
And just a follow-up on that, we have been talking about the scientific basis and the scientific approach, and I think there is a misleading sense there to the extent that, I mean, even in natural sciences today, people are discussing that actually every observation, every experience, every fact is in fact organized according to our categories of thought. So there is no objectivity which we can perceive without any subjective interaction. So that takes us to the discussions about what is the scientific knowledge, how it is being produced. So can actually the character, the content of the scientific knowledge be totally separated from the way it is being produced, which is a totally different question regarding the academia and so on today on the one hand. But also during your lecture, which I enjoyed a lot, the question of the definition, the Robbins definition of the economics consistently came up. And I think there's a very good reason why the economic science has been constantly emphasizing that it is objective, that it is value-free. And this is a trap. The moment we think that it is actually value-free, and the moment we believe we have to rebring values into the economic science, I think we are in that trap. Because the way that economic science, the objective value-free science is organized is based on values. We see that. I mean, Jevons, when he was writing in the 1870s, he literally wrote, the point of departure should be to reject any absurd sense, this absurd conception of the society as a class society. He says we have to, it is a normative statement, we have to treat all individuals as equals. So he just starts actually with making a huge step in terms of introducing his own subjectivity, you can call it values or point of view. And that brings me, I mean, I echo Srishti's point at this point. There are alternative paradigms, and what makes the dominant paradigm the dominant paradigm. So in my view, it is rather each paradigm, each approach has its values and its specific claims, and it is ultimately a system of beliefs, and it does involve subjectivity. So we can't escape that. And maybe that can be helpful when we are discussing also how to bring in values and ethics.
Yeah, I think, again, a very, very, very valid point. The paradox is that subjective utility leads to an objective welfare function. I mean, that's the claim. As to what makes paradigms dominant, it's power, isn't it? I mean, I think Marx is unrivaled on the role of power in shaping thought as a kind of superstructure, and also the genius of economics in making power invisible. Yes. And it's just not there, except in the form of monopoly in the market, but not power over the political process. I mean, that just isn't there. Not power over the consumer. But there is some producer power. And good economic policy must aim to diminish it. I mean, that seems to me how it treats power. You're right, of course. I mean, the old opposition between soft social science and hard natural science has been dissolving, and we now are much more inclined to accept the fact that there are facts out there, but the way we can view them is through mental constructs, which, our mental constructs change, reality doesn't change. The way we see reality changes. But nevertheless, it remains true, I think, that the physical sciences, the natural sciences, seek to investigate matter, whereas social sciences try to understand mind. There's nothing to observe which is objectively out there. What they're observing is human behavior. And you can set up a paradigm of some kind. You can make all these very strong assumptions. And they are normative assumptions. I think Jevons is a good example of what you're saying. He did believe that economics had to set itself against Marx and Marx's theory of exploitation, class theory. But to go back to then the weakness of ethics, if you want to use a class analysis of any kind or a group analysis, what's the group? All these groups are also in a state of flux and dissolving and reforming. And that's why the standard kind of game of politics is falling to pieces, because you no longer have a working class that votes left for redistribution, other things, and a sort of business class that opposes all that and believes in free markets. Or they never did believe in free markets actually, but think policies that help them. But that's no longer a basis of God. Cutting across it is the thing you mentioned earlier, which is nationalism has suddenly re-emerged from the shadows of fascism into becoming quite a dominant movement in Western societies, but not just in Western societies, actually, all over the world in one form or another.
I mean, I also think it's important not to underestimate the ability of the mainstream economic approach to also co-opt a lot of the debates around even ethics and morality. I think inequality is a great example of something like that. Ricardo, when he wrote, he said that talking about distribution is the core of political economy. And as you mentioned, Robert Lucas said it was poisonous. That was the word that he used, that you were looking for. It was poisonous to look for questions of distribution. But their ability to discuss inequality. So, for example, what I noticed today is that a lot of the debate around growth and distribution is about how growth can impact distribution, how growth can impact inequality. Will it increase it or decrease it? Yet what we never ask the question is, why do we not have a debate? Why does the mainstream not debate the reverse causality? Why is there no discussion about how inequality, how distribution actually impacts growth? And I think that's one of the questions that I wanted to ask you. Why do you think there's no sufficient debate around how distribution impacts growth? Is it merely a political willingness or something else?
Well, I think it's because that kind of discussion would be deeply distressing to the power holders in the society. There is a dissident movement in economics which is exactly about this, and it has a bit of an ancestry in Marx, but also in other theories. I'm talking about underconsumption theory, which is exactly about how inequality impacts the progress of a capitalist society by producing crises of overproduction. And then, of course, Hobson used it to explain imperialism, and then Lenin took it over. And but that discussion has died away. And yet I think it's very ripe for revival, because it seems to me that shortage of mass purchasing power was actually a very important cause of the crisis of 2008. 2008, that's right. Too much power, purchasing power was heaped up in one bit of the economy and not enough in another. And that made it very, the economies unstable. You can talk about it in terms of just the increase of financialization. I mean, that'd be one way of discussing it. And it makes them unstable, not just because the rich have a greater propensity to save than poorer people, but also because it places too much a burden on investment. and investment is volatile. So if you want to be an underconsumptionist, you must really be in favour of quite a strong state investment function to overcome the volatility of the inequality. A state investment function can also actually deal with some of the manifestations of inequality. I mean, it can do something to reverse that. So that is a discussion that's very important to have. But do you find echoes of underconsumptionism in mainstream economics? It seems it's easy enough to say, well, it was just a mistake of Hobson. He just didn't understand the way the rate of interest works to equalize decisions, production and consumption decisions at the margin. He just didn't understand that. So that's the simple refutation of Hobson. Out of the window, underconsumption. And yet, Marxists, who are also underconsumptionists, used that kind of analysis to explain the Great Depression. And modern Marxists, quasi-Marxist underconsumptionists like the American labor economist Thomas Paley, that's the center of his explanation of what went wrong in 2008. So there is this, but how do you get it into the textbooks? Any dominating paradigm is very, very good at defending itself in ways that Thomas Kuhn has explained, and Imre Lakatos, and it defends itself. It's like it may be wounded, but its defenses are strong, and one of its defenses is, as you say, incorporating heresies and sort of treating them sort of, in the outer areas of the subject. They can be discussed, and no doubt there can be some research programs. But as you can't refute the mainstream, it remains invulnerable.
On that, if I may, Professor.
Please.
The refutability of the mainstream paradigm, I feel, is a bit of a sticky situation because, for example, again, going back to Kuhn, for example, he says that paradigms are dominant and there may be other paradigms that exist at that time. It need not be the case that the dominant paradigm explains the reality perfectly well. It is just that it is the dominant paradigm, right, and it's able to modify itself to keep some kind of pace with the critiques that emerge.
Okay.
We had the Cambridge Capital controversies between the two Cambridges rage on for years, in which, I'm sure we would agree that the neoclassical economics was actually the loser of that debate in certain senses, in that they did encounter critiques about their methodology that they could not brush under the carpet. However, 2018 neoclassical economics is the mainstream economics of the time. So the question of refutability and the power of refutability in leading to a paradigm change, that for me is a big question.
It's a big question. If you can't refute a paradigm, there's nothing to bring it to an end. And as you say, the capital switching controversy, it had no impact on the mainstream. They lost the battle. They said, "Oh, so what? Okay, it's of no importance." Considering the heavy guns involved in the controversy at the time, it sort of just disappeared. And the concept of capital as a factor of production, independent factor of production, and in a way, I mean, the Cambridge people were going back to the problem of how you incorporate capital in a cost of production theory. I mean, they hark back to that. They lost the battle in the 19th century. They didn't lose the battle. It's just that it wasn't felt that the opposition paradigm had enough useful explanatory power or policy guidance for what people were looking for. I think I haven't got a good answer to what you said, and it's a puzzle for me. But I think the general point that paradigm shifts are very rare in economics has got to do with the fact that it's not a hard science. I think if it were a hard science, you would get some paradigm shifts, equivalent, let's say, to, Newtonian mechanics to quantum mechanics, or Ptolemaic astronomy to Copernican astronomy. You would get that, but I can't think of any shifts really of that magnitude in economics. I regard Keynes as a failed attempt to dislodge the paradigm, and he was dealt with by incorporating some policy aspects of Keynes into the mainstream, but not his theoretical criticisms.
Yeah. I just want to say, just an example of that. So you had the neoclassical synthesis and today new Keynesianism as a result of that. When you look at Galbraith and Veblen's institutional economics, you find today the new institutionalist economics.
Yeah.
So when you talk about Herbert Simon and behavioral economics, you have today's behavioral economics. So the idea, again, is the ability of neoclassical economics to incorporate a lot of the criticism, whether it's about Keynesianism, effective demand, institutionalism, and then turn it into something that becomes, it's already part of what we talk about. We talk about the imperfections.
Yeah.
I don't know if you...
This is just like capitalism, being able to appropriate and re-articulate moderately radical demands. But I think there's an elephant in the room which we have to call with its name, namely power and power relations. We are all part of academia, and we know how academic knowledge is being produced, how funding is raised, how you get positions at schools, how you get positions to teach, and so on and so forth. We all know this. And the problem, I think, to merely grasp the struggle on the level, on the terrain of the quality of competing paradigms is just as Srishti put, and you gave more examples. Take the Cambridge Capital controversies. Paul Samuelson literally wrote that he wouldn't be able to defend the aggregate production function. It is destroyed. One of the arguments, if you approach it only by neglecting, by ignoring the power relations, let me say, but only by focusing on the competing paradigms, well, the neoclassical theory is rather like a conspiracy theory, because all the marginalist argument is moving in circles, and you can't refute it.
Yeah.
It always succeeds in reproducing itself.
Yeah, and the sponge, it's like a sponge. The sponge becomes sort of flabbier, and no decently trained economist would subscribe to the crude version of it. But it's there. It's always there at the core of everything. I think the way Keynes was absorbed is two examples. First of all, I think the new institutional economics has a very shaky relationship with the old institutional economics. So game theory and things of this kind are heavily brought into play to explain norms. The sociological explanation is straightforward, but they can't accept that because it goes against their concept of the individual and the self-interested individual. They say, fine, Keynes is. We understand that prices are sticky, and therefore the adjustment is a bit more sluggish than the pure theory would believe. So we have to relax some of the assumptions, and the relaxation is crucial for policy because we can't actually do the Hayek program of allowing the whole economy to collapse and then hoping that it'll be healthier and leaner as it gets back to its feet. So. For policy, it's good. You can also accept, if you accept sluggishness there in the price system, you can also accept the income determination version of Keynes. That also is great, and you can say, yes, of course, we'll accept that there are different types of equilibria, optimal equilibria, and the Keynesian types of equilibria are not natural, and therefore there will be a tendency for them not to last. And then you get a Hayekian criticism that if you try and do something, actually take policy measures, you're really preventing the natural forces of recovery from doing their work, however slowly. And so short-run Phillips curves are sort of part of the new Keynesian arsenal, and they're also part of the central bank's reaction function. and that's why they're given a little time in carrying out their mandates. But what does this represent in terms of a paradigm shift? It isn't a paradigm shift. New inconvenient facts from the world of politics and social life come in. They invade economics because a lot of economists are worried about the failure of mainstream economics to deal with these things. And then they become part of the marginal. I mean, when you talked about, the power structure within academic life, I would also like to point out that many of the heterodox schools are in less good universities. They're sort of almost pushed out, where they have groups and they talk and they have conferences and they have journals, not highly prestigious journals. And that's also a way of marginalizing it while saying, but look, we are open to all these. If you can really prove your point, then of course we're willing to accept it. But they can't. You can't prove the point.
I think there's a connection between the idea of paradigm and this idea of equilibrium with what you brought up earlier about these theological vestiges in the field of economics. When we're talking about an idea like externalities, which you brought up, there is this sort of theological idea that these are the acceptable results that the economic system can generate, and everything outside of these acceptable results is an externality. Or sometimes vice versa. There are things within the results that we patently see that are not accepted. And I think this is a big way in which power is sort of maintained or expressed when you're talking about a certain framework. There is this pseudo-theological idea that there is this accepted wisdom. The priesthood tells you which critiques are acceptable, how to make those critiques more acceptable, which results are acceptable. For example, it's always been, in the 10 or so years that I've been studying economics, it's been astounding to me that unemployment is never counted as a product or something that the economic system generates. It's always taken as an externality, or it's there, or, in some cases it's there, but it shouldn't be there. But nobody sits down and says, no, this is a product that is generated by this system. And I think a lot of the expression of power results on this sort of pseudo-theological ability to close the doors to certain things and open them to others.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And natural rate of unemployment could be 50%. I mean, depending on how your labour market is set up. Economics tells you what the consequences would be of having labour markets which don't clear. Then you get a lot of unemployment.
I think some of this also has to do with the way that we changed when we went from classical political economy to neoclassical economics. The idea of what economics is supposed to do went from studying how human society reproduces itself to individuals in situations of scarcity making the best decision possible. And that itself leads to the idea of externalities. When you're studying how an economy or a society is supposed to reproduce itself, climate change is very much a part of that problem. Whereas if you are in a completely individualized scenario in which you are a producer wanting to maximize your profit, you have inputs and your output is just the product that you create, climate change is just completely out of the picture, out of the purview of economics even. So the way that we are defining the field is in itself then back to your sort of ethics question. That in itself is a normative value judgment in a way.
Yeah, but economics has taken on board climate change finally, because it then reduces the rate of discount, so all those vast issues to do with what we're doing to nature is just a discounting problem, and it can lead. It suggests policy, but it doesn't give anyone a motive, really, for carrying out those policies. The other thing that occurred to me about what's wrong with it arose out of a number of comments. What's wrong with the way economics describes human behavior is that people don't actually recognize themselves in descriptions that economists give of the way rational people behave. They don't recognize themselves in those descriptions. And it's a great puzzle. It means that actually economists and their maths aren't escaping the cave at all. They're sort of trapped in their own mental constructions, which they take to be reality. But actually, the people outside the cave don't recognize that at all. So there is this constant dissatisfaction with what economists tell you are and what you feel you are. This disjunction. But that's maybe a bit of a distraction. But I mean, to go back to the point, where are the? I think a point I did raise right at the end. What sort of ethics are we going to use in order to challenge the hegemony of arithmetic, Stigler's arithmetic? How are we to prevent these kinds of issues like climate change from being reduced to arithmetic? And there I think one has to take into account that ethics itself is in a state of dissolution. I'm conscious of being rather Euro and American centered when I talk about all this, and it may be that there are bigger intellectual resources, moral resources available in developing countries, or less developing countries, to sort of plot a future that doesn't just reproduce the trajectory of Western societies. I mean, for example, there is actually a revival in usury theory. When people talk about capping rates of interest, they don't talk about the dependence of that on medieval ideas of the just price, but that's what they have in mind. And when people talk about the predatory lending of banks, they are actually referring to issues of fairness between creditors and debtors. But none of that is recognized in mainstream economics. These are voluntary decisions, and you're just the mechanisms that are in play are simply efficient mechanisms for allocating capital between different uses. But is there? I mean, I'm thinking of the fact that in Islamic societies, they've never abandoned usury law. I mean, that's always been. But does it have any influence on the way the financial affairs of those societies are conducted? I'm asking a question. I don't know the answer.
Not in my experience, I think. Not at all. I think those usury laws are there, but in the end, the draw of global capital and the need to be able to engage with the world in a bigger way, particularly when you're looking at countries like the Gulf states, ends up being greatly dominant over the idea that usury is still in principle prescribed under Islam. And not just in the Gulf states, in the very different sort of Shia state of Iran, you have the same situation. Very, very rapid neoliberal reforms that are taking place right now, and the idea that Sharia says anything at all about interest rates or usury or anything like this just seems to be swept under the rug. They come up with some fatwa or something to sort of tweak it, and they get the result that they want.
A lot of there's, in Islamic finance, particularly Islamic banking, what you have is similar activities to what you have in normal banking, but what really differs is some of the naming that they use. So they would use names like musharaka, which means participation, or murabaha, which means sharing the profit. But in the end, what happens is very similar to what you would have in a lot of normal banking situations.
So there's sort of, sorry.
No, I still think that this is the interest rate in particular is an area where ethical considerations remain pretty much present. And for example, you have Keynes speaking about the euthanasia of the rentiers, Islamic economics, well, Marx, of course, regarding them as social parasites. So why do you think this is the case, which, of course, not in mainstream economics, but other schools of thought has persistently criticized on ethical backgrounds
Well,
the interest rate?
yeah, I mean, there's been always a big debate about who carries the moral responsibility as between the creditor and the debtor. I mean, that's gone right back to the beginning of time, virtually, and of course the debate goes on. Let's say with the austerity policies which are imposed on Greece and other debtors. Is it their myopia or that's caused them, or greed that's caused them to get so heavily in debt? Is it the bankers that actually were just lending the money which they knew they'd never be repaid because they were going to be bailed out? So economics talks about these things in terms of moral hazard and one thing or another. But obviously that is a hugely important issue, and it should influence policy. But in mainstream economics, it doesn't exist as a problem. You're making voluntary contracts. Now, you can talk about inequalities of information. That, of course, is a totally reputable subject, the economics of imperfect information. Yeah, well, I mean, Stiglitz and many others. And that's part of mainstream, virtually. But again, I'm not sure that mainstream regards it as crippling for their general picture, because I have a feeling they think that, if you could provide better information, if you could set up organizations that produce impartial information, credit rating agencies were meant to, but of course be impartial judges of the credit worthiness of borrowers, but they weren't because they were paid by the banks. But that's a reform we can conceive of, can't we? We can say, okay, they should be freed from, their paymaster should be some the state or some organization which is committed to the public good and not the interest of the.
But I wonder if not at least part of the discussion around inflation actually relates to that. I'm wondering if at least not just one part of the part of the role of international financial institutions and central banks is to control inflation. And I'm wondering if not at least part of that has to roll with who benefits and does not benefit from inflation, particularly looking at the people who, creditors versus debtors, and who are the people that lose when inflation happens. I'm not talking about hyperinflation, but I'm talking about inflation in general. I think it at least informs part of the decisions around monetary policy and policies that relate to inflation.
Power comes into that. I mean, quantity theory of money is creditor theory. And you find that when debtor coalitions are powerful, they abandon the quantity theory of money, and then endogenous money comes into its own, and then in other periods exogenous money. Which, of course, all one's saying is that economics is quite weak as a science. And, they've tried, many have tried, going back to Newcomb in the 19th century, and then Fisher, and then Friedman, to establish the validity of the quantity theory of money empirically, and they've all broken down, as they were bound to break down. You could forecast their breakdown. But so you're in power situations. But what kinds of power configurations are required to break out of the cave?
So that's exactly. I mean, I thought I was digressing too much in my thought, but I think we are ending up with the same point. I was thinking about. I think the best sentence in Piketty's work is like the price system knows neither morals nor limits. So it doesn't have morals or limits. And I have been thinking about like. I have been trying to situate the desire, the willingness to bring in ethics back to economics, and asking if it is absolutely the priority for us. And for that, I found myself thinking about Bertolt Brecht's Place, where one of the fundamental conflicts is always some people, lower class people, trying to act in a good way, ethical way, trying to be good people, help the others, but are not being allowed to do so by the very systemic incentives that they get from their environment, because the only way to survive is actually to show some sort of accordance with the system. And I can't totally convince myself on the premise that the primary means of fighting this systemic context is through means of ethics. I may be sounding
Well, you think it is or isn't?
It isn't.
Yeah. So what is the primary means?
Big question.
If I may just maybe a little antiquarian point, maybe in a confrontation between ethics, or when you bring ethics and economics together, the big loser turns out to be ethics rather than economics. That the question of influence goes from these, you can call profane morals, from economics start invading ethical concepts of society. And there was a school of thought in the early 19th century of English clerics from Oxford who made a very vigorous defense of economics being a completely value-free science, because that's the only way they felt that they could protect the rest of society from economics' influence. So maybe in the confrontation between ethics and economics, or in the meeting between ethics and economics, ethics might be the loser. And economic concepts, the market concepts, start invading other aspects of society.
Yeah, I mean, market concepts have invaded everything. I mean, ethics by 1983, Stigler was able to say mathematics has no symbols for confused ideas. So ethics is confused, and economics is symbolically symbols, and treats with symbols which are meant to express quite precise concepts. So ethics has been a loser, long-term loser, but I was arguing that there's reason to believe that it's weaker today than it was in the 19th century, and that the attempt to isolate economics from the rest of the way the world works, it has broken down. I mean, because economics has invaded everything else. And therefore, I'm left with your question. I mean, if ethics is no good, then I suppose Marx would say, well, power has to decide these things. And then the hope is that the power is on the side of the good, because the good are the majority. You see, that was the way Marx looked upon it. The interests of working class were better. I mean, were ethically stronger. They were bound to be, because they represented the interests of most people. Whereas on the other side, there were the interests of of a class of owners. Was Marx really saying is that ethics goes with the biggest battalions because they represent the more general interest of the society, as opposed to the particular interests of owners of capital? Was that what you say? If he was saying that, you can actually, of course, make arguments against that. But I don't want to make those arguments now. All I want to make is that I don't know where the power comes from, where a Marxist would locate his source of power for challenging the existing system.
If I may, I think part of it is also, like what Gunay was saying and what you brought up, part of it is also in the given system, are ethics, any ethics, strong enough to overcome the motion of capital and the motion of profit? Mm-hmm. Can the system be guided by something other than these motives? Is it capable of making those macro decisions at all? And then if not, then I think that is where the locus of change would lie as well. To make a system which can be guided by human intention.
Yeah.
In a predictable manner.
But it is guided by human intentions. The existing system, someone intends that some people intend that things should be as they are. It's not that there's some sort of outside force that is creating this system that is alien to humankind. I always come to this argument. I always feel it relates to the idea of technological determinism. Much of economics treats technology as exogenous in growth models. But of course, that's just for convenience. It's not exogenous. I mean, machines don't will their future. People use the machines, and they use them in particular ways. I got interested recently in the question of automation and its impact on human well-being, and the invariable line from all the literature is this is irreversible. To slow it down is certainly antediluvian, and all you have to do is find ways of managing the transition properly, and so your education programs come in, and then the long run vista of how everyone will have a richer life because the burden of toil will be lifted and more satisfying jobs. So they very rarely talk about more satisfying jobs, but that may be but it's not. You can't philosophically say that technology is determines what's going to happen. But weren't you coming close to saying that? That there's a momentum here which is almost beyond our control, and all we can hope to do is maybe modify bits and pieces of it to make us more comfortable with it.
Maybe not
you weren't quite
technology in
saying
itself, but the logic that leads to greater technological advancement, accumulation, whatever you want to call it, by every single producer, whether they want to or not.
Okay, well then surely what drives them, and I think Marx really was right about this, is the competitive market. Mm-hmm. If you then create a global market, which is what globalization has been about, an integrated global market in which national frontiers are irrelevant, then of course you have no opposition to, whereas a single country can decide on its own rate of technological dynamism if it wants to. Can just but if you're part of a global market, then your material welfare starts to depend on being in this particular chain. So there is a case for economic nationalism. Of course there is. You just say, well, why should we accept the logic of globalization, the competitive logic, when what we're being offered is to take part in a race whose end is not clear, but it's to our advantage to be in that race, because otherwise we get left behind in some way. That's really, I think, the dynamic behind. I'm very skeptical about globalization. I think I'm not really instinctively in favour of it. At least I think a lot. It should get much slower. A lot of these things to give people time to adapt and be comfortable. To be comfortable as human beings with what's happening.
I think globalization as such is not the problem, because behind that globalization still we have the driving mechanism of the competition, and competition has its very, very clear-cut
Yeah, but
rules.
how do you get globalization without competition?
Not within the system.
You used to have planned trade, you used to have all those things that were associated with the socialist bloc. They allocated these things by means of a central plan. But no one wants that anymore, do they? I mean, I've never read anything which says let's go back to the economics of socialism.
Well, there are many surveys actually in the ex-socialist countries in which significant shares of the population. I mean, it's not like saying black and white. It was the perfect social society and the social system, and this is the worst one. But when comparing to most of the people, especially those who are deprived by their material wealth and also income security and job security and everything, do have a longing for the socialist societies in which they lived, I guess. I mean, that's at least what I see in those surveys.
Almost universal from what I've seen across the ex-communist countries, actually.
Which doesn't mean that these
Obviously does not.
these systems were free of any
And
problems.
is it across all age groups?
I mean, the ones that I refer to are those who actually experienced the periods of transition
Yeah.
in which they were deprived actually of any benefits that they had.
Okay, the task then may be to work out a form of feasible socialism.
I think that's a good conclusion.
Anyway, maybe we should stop.
But a
there.
feasible
That's a
Not
good
agree with.
dissertation.